I am Daniel Lucas, and welcome to Book 101 Review. Book 101 is all about the books that I read for the last 40 years, and today I have my special guest. He's the author of historical novels, no other than Mr. C.Engdahl.
Hello, everybody. Hello, Daniel.
Yes, Mr. Cody is my avid guest. So, Mr. Cody, again, can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, my name is Cody C.Engdahl. You can find me and my books on Amazon.com or Amazon UK or wherever you get your Amazon books. I'm the author of 5 novels and 2 nonfiction works. My work is tied to basically 19th century warfare. I have a trilogy about the American Civil War, and then there's a prequel to that, and that's about the parents of the main character. It's how they meet, fall in love, run away together, and wind up in the Mexican American War. My latest book is called The Prussian Prince, and that book takes place after the American Civil War, in which the main character from the trilogy goes home to Detroit and finds out that his German wife has gone back to Berlin. So he's got to go there to be with her, and he ends up getting tangled in the Austrian-Prussian War of 1866. I'm on chapter 13 right now. I'm currently writing The French Fiasco, which is the sequel to that, in which that character finds himself now mixed up in the Franco-Prussian.
Looking forward. So,
Thanks, sir.
what is the initial step should one take to begin the process of writing historical novel?
Yeah, I think there's two things, at least for me, is that my books all have a kind of a dual plot. So there is the historical plot, and then there is the story of my characters interwoven into that plot. So, for example, when I first started writing the trilogy, I knew what I wanted to write about someone from Detroit like me getting involved in the American Civil War. So I picked out a regiment, the Second Michigan Cavalry, and plotted their career through that war and looked at it and divided that up into 3 books. And then with each book ending with a major battle. But then I started crafting my fictional story to go with that. And pretty much by the time I got halfway through writing the first book, that started sort of taking over. So it's a really interesting thing, Daniel. And I don't know, I'm just one author of many. I know many people have different approaches, but for me, the historic story is very important. So it's always crafting my story to fit into the real story so that when you read any of my books, you're going to get an accurate story about the history with just my story mixed in, if that makes any sense. So they kind of both drive each other, I guess. And even right now, I'm writing about my character is on the run now, and it's after the Battle of Spicheren. And so I have to do a lot of research of like where is the French army going, how far back are the Prussians pursuing them right now, and and so it's interesting because I have in my head how I want my story to play out, but I'm also confined to make by how the history plays out, so that both of them serve each other. It's fun. It can be frustrating at times, but I think it's an interesting thing, and I think in the end, from the reader, what I'm hoping is that they get an entertaining story, a riveting action adventure, romantic, swashbuckling story that is shrouded in real history. So they get done with one of my books and uh, they can with confidence speak about some of these events, like the Franco-Prussian War.
How important is the outlining before diving into the writing the first draft of making historical novel?
I would say it's important. It's important. Um, I would say, they talk about in the literary world in writing that there is they kind of set this binary system of pantsers and plotters. And plotters are people who plot out everything and they have everything outlined first, and then they just flesh it out while writing the book. And then there are pantsers who just kind of start out with an idea, start building characters, and allow the characters to kind of drive the plot. And and so they don't know how their books are going to end when they start writing them. And there's pluses and minuses to both of them. I think for plotters, you get much more satisfying plots because things kind of make sense and everything's kind of driving towards that conclusion. But the downside of that is sometimes things can seem contrived with a certain amount of fatalism. The plus side of being a pantser, which means flying by the seat of your pants, which is an expression we say when we're just improvising in life. For pantsers, the upside of that is that they can create really interesting characters and have motivations that make sense because the characters are driving the plot. The problem with that is that pantsers have a hard time finishing their books, and sometimes their plots seem to dawdle and have no direction. So I think that instead of a binary system like you're one or the other, it's more like a scale, right? And for me, it's important to start out with I know how my book starts, I know how I want it to end, I know the things I want to have happen in the middle. But I also allow myself a lot of room to surprise myself because as I start writing things, things change. Because I get to a situation, I'm like, okay, now what would really happen here? Well, not what I want to have happen, but what would happen. And so I feel like it's important to have a good idea of what you want your book to be when you start. But you also have to be flexible as you're writing because you will surprise yourself. Your characters, if you write them well, will surprise you as well.
Definitely, very well said, Mr. Cody. So,
Thank you.
what techniques can help in developing compelling and believable characters?
Yeah,
Characters.
characters. Yeah, I think what's important, and I'll tell you, I started writing when I was in the sixth grade. I wrote short stories, and my characters were very one, two dimensional, one dimensional. They're archetypes, right? And I think that, and I had some failed attempts at writing novels when I was younger, and so I didn't get to writing. I'm not going to give away my age, but or my weight, but I started writing, later on in my life, and I've had a lived experience, and I've known a lot of people. I've had a kind of a wild life. I mean, when I was a child, I went to three different elementary schools, two junior high schools, and three high schools because my parents moved around. So I was always starting over and meeting new people, and that carried on into my adulthood. And I've lived in Europe twice. I lived in Hungary. I lived in Portugal. I've lived in Japan. I've traveled a lot. I've known a lot of people, and I've lived a lot of lives. And so, for me, writing characters, I think the biggest mistake people make, like a lot of hack writers, will make everything about themselves. Like, I want to write where I'm actually the main character. I'm just using a different name. Yeah, I think that's kind of shallow. I think, and ultimately unsatisfying and contrived, except for the writer themselves. I think that because I've met so many people and experienced humanity at so many different levels, I'm able to draw from that and create characters based off of the people I've known. Now, I don't ever create a character that's exactly like someone I know, but I've used my experiences to understand how certain people are and to see certain patterns and certain types of people. And so I think that helps me write. I have a character, Pierre Gottfried, who is based off of a real man that I knew when I lived in Hungary, and Pierre is a character in Mexico, My Love, and spoiler alert, he's going to reappear in the French Fiasco, and he's a one of those. He's kind of a villain, but he's also kind of a villain that you like and you're cheering for, and he's got depth. And it's because I knew the real Peter, in real life and made him very much like him. So I think drawing from your own life experience, because that's where you're going to find real people, not someone that you make up in your mind, like some big warrior is big and muscular and he's just better at everything than everybody else, or some young woman who's super independent and strong and she never makes any mistakes. Those are very flat and unsatisfying and unrelatable, but real people. Um, and once you start using your experiences with real people, then your characters will have depth. They'll have flaws. They'll seem real because they'll struggle with the same things that you and I struggle with.
Yes, people, real people. So, how does someone choose the right setting for their story and why it is important?
Yeah, I would say that, especially when you're writing historical fiction, the setting is almost a character into itself. So most of well, I guess all my books are set in the background of war. And of course, it's not constant, my books aren't constantly about the war, but my characters are acting in and around the battles and the army is moving, and so that becomes a character into itself because it has its own identity and its own it's identifiable. The American Civil War, for example, what was happening as northern armies were tearing through the South, or the Franco-Prussian War, which I'm writing right now, in which France declares war on Germany, sputters in their attempt to invade Germany, and then immediately are put on the run as the Germans come sweeping across the border. So, in historical fiction, I think it's kind of like the intent is that I think most people say, like, I'm going to write a book that takes place in ancient Rome, and they start from there, and then that dictates the kind of characters and the kind of plots you can have. So uh, I also think that there are certain stories that can fit anywhere. I have a good friend of mine, Matthew Harvey, and he writes like early British medieval stuff, sword and shield, Vikings, Anglo Saxons, and he just wrote a western. And I was really interested in it, and I read it, and I got an advanced copy. I read it, I reviewed it, and what I found that was interesting is that the story, because it's a human story, is it could have been written in medieval England or in Rome or during the Franco-Prussian War. But Harvey wrote this story in the American West. And I thought that was interesting because it's so a lot of these stories have universal human themes to them. And then we can play them out how they would fit into these different settings, like the Wild West or the Franco-Prussian War.
Very well said, Mr. Cody. So, what are the effective ways to build plot that keeps readers engaged from the beginning to end?
Yeah, this is something that I think I've been unconsciously doing uh, from the beginning, but now I'm very conscious of it, and I think it really works for me. And I know it works because I have great read through, meaning I can see with my sales that people buy book one and they read all the way through the series. Is that, like I said, I loosely plot my novels and then allow them to change as I write them, and allow myself to be surprised. But one of the things I do, Daniel, is that when I'm dreaming up the plot in the beginning, I come up with what's at the beginning, what's in the end, and then I have these moments that I think of that I want to have happen. And so you can't just go moment to moment because it'll feel very contrived. So once you do come to a moment, you have to start building the next one. And so it's a series of, I mean, most books you have a plot, the tension goes up and down, and then you have a climax, and then the end of the book. So what I do is I build. I have these, what I like to think of as great dramatic moments that is going to make the reader gasp, but I have to get there. So with each one of those, I'm building up to it. I'm building up the tension. building up the mystery and the surprise, and then having that moment and making it really as big as possible, so that the reader is not just trying to read to the climax of the book, but has several hills to climb and summits to stand on top of as they dig deeper and deeper into the story.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Cody. But before we go on, we want to shout out our listeners in Florida State. So in Lake Worth, I got 32% audience share. Fort Lauderdale, uh, Boynton Beach, Hollywood, Sarasota, Miami, Hanson City, Tampa, Jacksonville, Orlando, and a lot more places in Florida. Thank you, Florida, for supporting this podcast, because this podcast is created to empower writers, authors all over the world, like Mr. Cody Engdahl. So,
Yes, and
Mr.
I am in Florida right now. I'm in Estero,
Yes.
which is somewhere between Fort Myers and Naples. So yeah, I love the Sunshine State. And thanks everybody for listening.
Yes. So, Mr. Cody, how can authors ensure their book's theme is clearly communicated and impactful, especially in historical novel?
Yeah, I think that's a very delicate process, because I find a lot of modern writing, especially like in Hollywood, that the themes sometimes become overly important, in which the theme is the entire movie or show, and then everything else is secondary to it. I think themes are important, but I think that they need to be subtle. And I think that number one, you need to be entertaining. I mean, for me, and I'm just one writer, and so other writers may be different, and they're not wrong. But me, being entertaining is number one. Then being historically accurate and informative, number two. Then themes, and themes help a lot. Like, for example, the theme of my last book was ch- the lost object, trying to get back to the lost object. And in that book, my main character realizes that he is in love with his wife, that he was a fool for ever running off to the war and leaving her behind. And so what drives the whole book is this quest to get back to that happiness that you once have. And sometimes you can't go back. The theme about, which is kind of ironic, because I'm here in Florida taking care of my father, who's in hospice and probably won't survive to the end of the year. But this wasn't contrived and it wasn't planned. But the theme of this book is um, the French fiasco is the importance of fathers, and what how a father defines what a father does to define somebody, and finding your father, and father figures and things like that. And so now, am I hitting you over the head with it? Am I making it overtly and abundant? No, no, it's hidden deep into the texture of it. And I think the most successful way of doing this is that in a way that your reader is affected by the theme, but maybe if they're not a critic or a literary expert, maybe didn't even realize it was there.
Definitely. So, how can writers effectively manage pacing to maintain reader interest throughout historical novels?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll tell you this. As you know, you and I are big fans of Alexander Dumas, who wrote the Musketeers, and he wrote the Count of Monte Cristo, and amongst a lot of other things. I I, I like the old serials, and sometimes they can go awry, but typically the way that people wrote, like Dumas and a lot of writers from like the late 19th, early 20th century, says they wrote a serial that appeared in a newspaper or a magazine, and then once it was finished, they would consolidate it into a novel. Now, sometimes because of that, like Netflix series, and sometimes because of that, you can tell when there's just like a filler episode, and I try not to do that. But basically, I think of my chapters. I think of my book as a season of a Netflix show, or Amazon or Disney Plus or whatever you want to say. But I think of it as a season, and that uh, each chapter is a episode of that. And I see a lot of I read a lot of other writers, and I'm not saying anybody's right or wrong, but I see that a lot of writers just simply number their chapter one, chapter two, chapter three. I name every chapter, and because I think it's interesting, because it's usually what I try to do is play a little game, like the name of the chapter is a little clue about what you're going to be reading. And like chapter one of the book I'm writing now is called "The Death of an Empire." Well, what does that mean? What are we talking about? And then you're surprised because it's a book about the Franco-Prussian War, but you read page one, and you're in Mexico, uh, but there's a reason why it's called that. And so I think if you think of your um, chapters as episodes, then you realize your chapter has to have its own structure. It has to have its own beginning, middle, and end, and has to have things happening in it. Because if someone watches a TV show like on Netflix, and you watch a whole episode and nothing happens, it's just a bunch of people sitting around talking about their feelings, they're probably not going to watch the next episode. So I think that I think when you write a novel, yes, or even a series like mine, because my whole series has a certain overall arc, and then each novel has an arc. But your episodes, your chapters have to do it too. And I think one of the ways of doing that is give it a title. Give it a title and make that title something that makes I wonder what this means. I can't wait to read this. The chapter I'm writing right now is chapter 13, um, uh, Prisoner of France. What does that mean? What's going to happen in it? And have things in each chapter have tension and resolution, and build up to those points, and constantly even if they're little things, constantly have tension and release. And that's what's going to drive the reader to keep reading. And I've read a lot of books, and maybe they're great, but I've read a lot of books in which you just have this long march to the climax. So slow build to it. And you're reading, 200 pages in, and you're like, when are things going to start happening, man? And then finally you get, the big climax, and then the denouement, and then you're over. I think you need to constantly give your reader little climaxes and little denouement. Just like
Definitely.
yeah.
So, in what ways can dialogue be used to reveal character and advance the plot in historical novel?
Yeah, I think I think a dialogue is something that a lot of people struggle with. And it can reveal a lot about the character, because they say in writing, show don't tell. So instead of saying, John was sad today, you can write that. You can have him say things that reveals how that he's sad, or the way he's feeling. Um, if you're clever, you can do a lot of exposition in the dialogue, but you gotta be careful not to make it seem contrived. And the biggest thing I think that people should do when they write, especially when it comes to dialogue. And dialogue is one of those things that some writers have a great ear for dialogue, and some don't. And that's okay. You can develop it as you go. But I read all my dialogue out loud. First of all, I read everything I write out loud to myself as I'm editing, to hear, does that ring true? Do people actually talk that way? Um, so I think one of the things you can do as a writer, well, I think every writer should do this. You should be very observant. You should be an observer of people, and constantly paying attention to not just what people say, but how they're saying it. And so that when you're going back through your novel and you're doing your editing, read it out loud, or sometimes I'll have Siri. I have a Mac. I can have Siri read it back to me because a lot of times I will correct things unconsciously as I'm reading out loud, and listen to how it sounds. Do people talk like that? Does that make sense? And also, if you're writing, historical, would that make sense back then? I had to train myself not to write the word okay, because okay doesn't come into our vernacular until like the mid 20th century. So just listen to your dialogue, and decide, judge for yourself. Do people talk like this, or does this sound contrived?
Definitely. So, how do authors decide on narrative point of view, and on what impact that this have on the story?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's something that is a constant struggle for me, or something that I have to constantly be conscious of, because you can tell a scene different ways, especially when you have characters um, uh, that have separate storylines that converge, and all of a sudden now they're together. So whose head are you in? I'm always looking for ways of finding tension, or finding um, holding back things from the reader so that they can discover it, so that it's surprising when it happens. So a lot of times when I have a scene, and well, I could be writing this from the point of view of the villain because I've been with that villain for a while, or I can do it from the hero, whichever one allows the most drama, because maybe one character knows something the other one doesn't. And so if you're setting up like a surprise or something like that, you can be in the head of the person who doesn't know what the surprise is that's coming, so that you can, and that character becomes almost a proxy for the reader. So you can use perspective to hide things. You can also use perspective to reveal things, because sometimes a character knows something that the other character doesn't know. You so and I think, there's no, as far as I know, there's no rule that you can follow. Like, well, if it's this way, then do this. You have to just, when you go into a scene, think what serves the story better. Is it better that I have this come from? I just did this. I had a big reveal where two characters, one who haven't seen each other in 25 years or longer, and one of them was only a baby. The other one, but he looks like his father. And so when the other one sees him for the first time, hasn't seen him since he was a child, is stunned, because at first he thinks it is the father. And so the way I did it was that the older character reveals himself when he pulls off his helmet, and the characters whose perspective we're in um, can't understand why this man is stunned and is saying, "Is it truly you?" Because he doesn't know that this man knew his father, and is seeing his father in him now. So I don't know if that was a clumsy way of describing it, but yeah, I think you can build tension, you can build mystery, and you can slowly reveal things by choosing whose perspective you're in. I've also heard people talk about a mistake that a lot of writers make, is they call head hopping. So you have to be careful about jumping perspective too much. Doesn't mean you can't do it, but you have to be, with everything, all things in moderation. So be careful about jumping around from one character's head to the next.
Very well said, Mr. Cody. But before we go on, I'm inviting you to please do listen to my other podcast, Food 101, our fourth season with Chef Alessandro, one of the best executive chef in one of the five-star hotel in downtown Toronto. Please do listen to our latest episode. We talk about our Food 101 culinary course, people. Food 101 Volume 3 principle available to purchase. Please do purchase a Volume 1 basic, Volume 2 is fundamental, and Volume 3 is Principal Food 101 Culinary Courses. So, Mr. Cody, what are the key considerations in revising and editing the draft to improve the clarity and coherence in historical novel?
Yeah, great question. So, once again, this is going to vary from writer to writer. Some writers like to just spit everything out. They sit down and they write their rough draft all the way through beginning to end, and then they go back in and they start doing the rewrite and revisions and things like that. And I find that's giving myself way too much work on the other side of it. So I have my own system, and this may not work for everybody. But when I sit down and write, the first thing I do is I read everything that I wrote in the last session. And even then, I'm making corrections and changing things. And that kind of gets me caught up to this is where I was and in the mood and the perspective and all that. And then I write. When I finish a chapter, I will then go and I will do kind of a mini editing session where I'll run it through spell check. I'll read the whole thing out loud to myself, and each time I do this, I'm making corrections. Then I'll have Siri read it to me. Then I'll run it through Grammarly and see if I can't tighten it up or find mistakes. And then I send a copy to my girlfriend. I email it to her so in case I have a computer crash, I still have it. And then I put it into the main document. So I have like a main document that has all the finished chapters where I'm building the book, but I write each chapter in a separate document. So I have a bunch of separate documents, but I have one master that once a chapter is done, it's put into the master document. I do this because I don't want to have to do major open heart surgery when I'm done with the rough draft, because I feel like that would be confusing and very laborious. So I try to make sure that my first draft is pretty clean by the time I finish it, and that there's not a lot of, for example, in my book right now, my character injures his foot in like the second chapter. And then I realized that injured foot needed to be a bigger plot point because it plays into things that happen later on. And so I make little notes as I'm editing and writing, say, hey, I need to go and do this. So I go back into the previous chapters and start inserting things to reinforce this. He injured his foot and it's getting worse and worse and worse, and it's getting infected, he's getting feverish, it's causing him it culminates into him being feverish and weak, and which plays into the plot. So that by the time I finish the first draft, there's certainly a lot of editing to be done, but it's not as big of a task. It's not as intensive as it would have been had I just written, straight through the first draft without looking at what I had been doing before. Now that's me. I know there's a lot of, I just read or listened to Stephen King's on writing. I think Stephen King says just to write the book first and don't look back until you're done and then go back and start changing things. Well, that works for King, and apparently it does. He's one of the greatest writers of our time. But not, and King will even say, not everything I do, what works for me may not work for you. So that's my take on it.
Well done, Mr. Cody. So, what is your inspiring message for those aspiring writers historical novel?
Yeah, I would say this. The hardest, I've been saying this even before I started writing novels, because I worked in television. I wrote TV commercials and then later on news stories and things like that. The hardest thing about writing is sitting down and writing. And any of you writers out there will know this to be true. One of the hardest things to do in your day is just to sit down and write. And I'll find everything I need to do before I do that. And that's why I try to write early in the morning. Writing a novel isn't something you just sit down, you write a novel, and you're done. It's a process. It's a long process. It takes For me, it takes about a year. Some people are able to whip out a novel in a couple of weeks or a month or so, and great for them. Me, it takes me a long time. Uh, the the thing is, it's just work, and it's not hard work. It's just work, and it's something you have to work at every day. And if you're writing novels, I think you should write every day. Now, some people can't. I get it. Some people have to like, well, I can write for 4 hours on Sunday. That's fine. But I feel like writing a little bit every day really works for me. It keeps my head in the story, and the time in between writing is really where the real work happens because I'm constantly revising what the story is going to be and thinking about things um, in between while I'm walking, while I'm doing the dishes, while I'm driving my car, while I'm doing other tasks. So so really it's a grind, and it's not necessarily hard all the time. It's just something that you have to keep at and you have to keep doing and be patient with yourself, but also be disciplined and just keep up the writing and keep doing, and you'll finish your novel, you'll get it done. And if you really want it to be good, listen to other people, listen to what they're saying. There's a lot of, not just me, there's a lot of writers out there who are saying a lot of the same things. Take the advice, show, don't tell. Be careful with your use of adjectives and adverbs. Doesn't mean you can't use them, but really make sure you can justify every single one in there. Tighten up your writing. Have people read it or read it to people and see what they have to say. Sometimes not all advice is right. So it's okay if someone says, oh, this is, I don't like this. Well, that's okay. That's just one person. But if a lot of people say that, well, listen to good advice.
Yes, people listen to Mr. Cody advice. So, Mr. Cody, can you please invite our listeners to support all your books?
Yes, I want you to be my friend. I write I write with the reader in mind. I think about myself as a adolescent, loving action adventure, wanting to read books that had it in it, high romance. When I mean romance, I don't mean necessarily like people making out. I mean just like that romantic, heroic, swashbuckling life that is bound, that's driven, but with a sense of honor, even honor amongst enemies. Um, I wrote, I write for the reader. I think about the people reading my book and what would make them excited and what would make them want to read more. Um, so all my books are on Amazon. You can get them there. I do keep copies in my trunk of my car. If anybody wants a signed copy from me, we can work something out if you contact me directly. I am on all the social media. Send me a friend request on Facebook. I think I'm only up to 3,000, so I'm allowed 5,000. Twitter, all the major social media. I want to be your friend. I want to hear from you. Let me know. Let me know if you don't like something or if you think I could do better with something. Uh, come come try out one of my books. Start with Rampage on the River or Mexico My Love, or pick any one in the middle. I mean, they're designed to be read in order, but I wrote each book so that if you only read that one book and not the other ones, you'd be fine. And yeah, I'd like to be your friend.
Yes, people, let's support Mr. Cody and Mr. Cody C.Engdahl, because if you support him, more and more historical novels to come.
Yep, writing
So,
one now.
Mr. Cody, thank you for your time.
You're welcome, Daniel. Thank you.
More to come, people. See you soon.